I'm Caroline Foster, 39 years old, and the last time I stepped foot on the family estate, it was to bury the woman who raised me the best way she knew how. I didn't get a moment alone at the gravesite, not with my sister Kaylee managing the guest list like a gala. The call never came. No invite. Just a letter on thick perfumed stationery delivered 2 days before the will reading. My name spelled out like I was some forgotten guest at a wedding. And by the time I reached that long gravel driveway, I knew I wasn't walking into grief. I was walking into a performance. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever been treated like a stranger in your own family. I was born and raised just outside Savannah. Not on a big estate, not with monogrammed napkins or garden luncheons, but with warmth and chores and dinner made from scratch. My mother, May Foster, was steady and proud. She taught Sunday school and baked her way through hard times. My father passed when I was 12. Kaylee was 15 and already being told she'd be the future of the Foster name. I don't remember anyone telling me what I'd be. I stayed in Georgia most of my life, got a job at the library downtown. Helped Mom when her hands started trembling and she couldn't thread a needle anymore. I didn't post about it. I didn't ask for praise. I just showed up, quietly. When Mom moved into hospice, Kaylee planned everything from her townhouse in Charleston. She called it managing the transition. I called every night. And when I could, I made the 4-hour drive with soup and warm socks, and sometimes just to sit beside her in the quiet. Mom gave me a scarf one of those nights, cream-colored soft with her initials stitched in blue. She pressed it into my hands and said, "Don't let them take everything." I didn't know what she meant. After she passed, I waited. I thought maybe Kaylee would call. Maybe we'd sit side by side and remember the same childhood. But all I got was a formal envelope with the estate lawyer's name printed across the top, and a note. You are requested to attend the reading of the will. No date for a gathering, no mention of family, just the location and time. I packed the scarf still folded the way she gave it to me. Charleston still smelled like salt and heat. The driveway was longer than I remembered. I parked around back like always. Kaylee used the front for guests. That hadn't changed. The housekeeper opened the door and gave me a polite nod, nothing more. Inside, it smelled like lemon polish and old lavender, just like Mom kept it. Kaylee's assistant met me in the foyer, young, glossy. She glanced at my shoes and said, "Oh, I didn't know you'd be attending." I held up the envelope. I was invited. "They're outside," she said. "Terrace garden." Of course. I stepped onto the flagstone where cousins and distant relatives chatted in linen and pastel. Kaylee spotted me immediately. Her voice curled out like a ribbon. "Look who showed up. Didn't know they were letting +1s to the will reading." A few people chuckled. Some didn't. I didn't respond. I just found the nearest chair under the striped canopy and took a seat at the edge of the long table. My dress was from Marshall's. My shoes had scuff marks, but I was here, and I had Mom's scarf tucked in my bag just beneath my hand. Across the table, Kaylee reached into her designer purse and slid something under the cloth to our Uncle Ray. It was quick practiced, but I saw it. That's when I knew this wasn't just a reading. It was a setup. The sun was still climbing, but the heat in the garden already carried that heavy, quiet weight, the kind that settles into the corners of old houses and long-held grudges. I kept my hands folded on my lap steady while the estate lawyer stepped out through the French doors. His name was Mr. Whitlow. Gray suit, quiet eyes, briefcase in hand. He looked like the kind of man who measured his words carefully, someone who knew what a pause could do in a room like this. Kaylee rose from her seat as if on cue. She brushed a hand across her skirt and moved to stand beside him, placing one palm lightly on his arm like they were old friends. Her voice carried across the table. "Let's just hope Caroline didn't bring one of her surprises," she said with a bright, false smile. A few people let out those awkward little laughs, not real ones, just enough to keep from being the first to speak up. I didn't look at her. I just sat still and watched the way Mr. Whitlow's brow dipped for a split second before he nodded and opened his briefcase. "We'll begin with confirming presence," he said, holding out a single sheet of paper. "Miss Caroline Foster, if you don't mind." I took it. 1 page. Blue header. Nothing but a block of legal text and a signature line. "Just me?" I asked. He nodded. "A formality." I glanced over. Aunt Irene shifted slightly in her chair, voice low as she leaned toward me. "They didn't ask me to sign anything last time," she whispered. Her tone wasn't surprised, more like she was thinking out loud. I held the paper in my hand, let my eyes drift down it again, then handed it back. "I'd like a copy," I said quietly. Kaylee's husband Michael turned his head just enough to glance at me but said nothing. That was his role in things, present, silent, agreeable. Mr. Whitlow nodded. "Of course." The breeze coming in through the tall windows stirred the lace curtains behind him. The room smelled like lemon polish and something floral, Kaylee's perfume probably. She leaned back in her seat and tilted her head. Carolyn was always the attentive daughter. "Wasn't she?" she said lightly. "All those calls late at night, all those visits, really made Mom feel like she was doing something wrong." No one laughed this time, but no one said anything either. I reached into my bag and found the scarf again. Cream soft, the blue stitching just visible where it curled around the edge. Mom had pressed it into my hand that night in hospice when her voice was barely more than breath. "Don't let them take everything," she'd whispered. At the time, I hadn't known what she meant. Mr. Whitlow cleared his throat. "If we're all settled," he said, "I'll begin the reading of the last will and testament of May Foster." He looked up, glanced around, and then his eyes landed on me. "You may want to sit down for this." The room went still, not quiet, still. That thick kind of stillness, where even the birds outside seemed to pause. Mr. Whitlow unfolded the will. His voice was calm, measured. Per the last legally witnessed and notarized testament, the entirety of the Foster estate property, monetary assets, personal belongings, and all residual income is hereby left to Caroline Foster. Behind me, I heard glass break. I didn't turn to see who dropped it. I didn't have to. Kaylee's hand jerked, knocking over her water glass. The air shifted again. What she said, breathless. Mr. Whitlow didn't flinch. "That is what the document states." I sat there, not moving, not blinking. My name, everything. Then he added, "However," of course there was a however. He held up another sheet of paper. "The inheritance is contingent on Miss Foster residing at the estate for a minimum of 1 year. No sale, redevelopment, or transfer of property rights is permitted during that time." He paused again. His voice was even when he continued. "Furthermore, Miss Kaylee Foster is barred from initiating or facilitating any structural changes, financial reassessments, or sale discussions concerning the estate during this period." The words felt heavier than the air. Kaylee stood so fast her chair scraped across the flagstone. "This is a joke," she snapped. "That's not what Mom wanted." She turned to face me. "You put that in her head, didn't you? All those phone calls acting like the victim, like you were the only one who cared." Aunt Irene reached toward her gently. "Kaylee." "No," she said sharply. "They need to hear this." Her arms swept toward the rest of the table, toward our cousins and the family friends hanging back near the garden wall. She didn't even visit for years. Then suddenly, when Mom got sick, she's there at her bedside, like Florence Nightingale rewriting history. I stared at the tablecloth. I kept my back straight. I didn't blink. "She guilted her into this," Kaylee said, voice rising. "She didn't even cry at the funeral." Mr. Whitlow stepped in calm but firm. Miss Foster, these terms were written in your mother's own hand. The will was signed in front of a notary and 2 independent witnesses. She was confused, Kaylee said. She didn't know what she was doing. I said she was tired, Aunt Irene said softly, not confused. Silence settled again, heavier this time, the kind that lingers when a truth has been spoken out loud. Did she leave anything else, I asked. My voice felt like it was coming from far away. Mr. Whitlow hesitated. Then he opened his briefcase again and pulled out a sealed envelope. She did, he said. This was left for you. I took it. Thick paper, heavier than it looked. I broke the seal and unfolded the letter. My name was written at the top in her handwriting, curved neat, a little shaky. I didn't plan to read it out loud, but I did. To Caroline, I began, my voice catching on the second line. You showed up when no one else did. You made me soup when I couldn't speak. You stayed even when Kaylee filed the power of attorney papers without telling me. No one interrupted. You are the only one who didn't ask me to sell the house only to rest in it. Still, the room stayed quiet. I was not confused when I wrote this. I read. I was tired but not confused. I changed the will after she tried to sell the house from under me. I looked up. Kaylee stood frozen. One of our cousins shifted uncomfortably in his seat. A friend of Mom's was shaking her head slowly. I didn't do anything she didn't want, Kaylee said brittle. She was sick, delirious. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. I held the letter out to Mr. Whitlow. Can you confirm the date? He leaned forward. Signed the same day her hospice nurse recorded full cognitive clarity. Witnessed by 2 of our staff, all properly filed. Kaylee's color drained. You talked to a realtor while she was recovering from pneumonia, I said quietly. You tried to move her out of her own life. Aunt Irene spoke gently. She was more herself in those final days than she'd been in years. And you? You tried to evict her. Kaylee stepped back, looking around. But no one moved. Not even Michael. I turned and walked toward the window, the letter still in my hands. I didn't say much. Just, she didn't want to be sold like property. I honored that. And this time, the silence that followed wasn't about shame. It was something else. The reading had ended, but no one really moved. People shifted in their chairs, cleared their throats, reached for coffee they didn't drink. The lawyer packed his things neatly, calm and methodical, while Kaylee stood near the archway, arms stiff at her sides, like she couldn't quite figure out whether to leave or demand the floor again. I stayed seated, the letter folded once in my lap, my fingers still tracing the soft edge of that scarf. The quiet didn't feel like peace. It felt like everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. We moved to the garden lounge after that, like the will reading had been just one more item on the schedule. A few round tables were set beneath white umbrellas, and someone had arranged trays of finger sandwiches and small desserts on silver carts. I sat near the window away from the chatter, holding a porcelain coffee cup I didn't remember owning. The scent of brewed tea and cold chicken salad floated through the air, mixing with the soft notes of jazz music playing through the outdoor speakers. It was the kind of music meant to smooth things over like a rug placed over a crack in the floor. Kaylee drifted through the space like nothing had happened. She smiled at guests leaned in with practiced concern, touched the backs of chairs like she was still hosting a party instead of reeling from the truth. I watched her from across the room. Her eyes flitted over to me, once then moved on. Aunt Irene sat beside me, quiet, her purse settled on her knees. She didn't speak, just nodded now and then when someone passed by. A few of our cousins looked over, gave short, unsure glances. One mouthed something that might have been, "You okay?" but didn't come over. I sipped my coffee and kept the letter tucked where it had been. It felt heavier now, even though it was just paper. Kaylee's voice rose just enough to be heard over the music. She stood near a trio of family friends, women who'd known us since we were kids, the kind who always sent Christmas cards and hugged tight at funerals. Caroline always had this way of making herself the victim. Kaylee said, her tone light, like she was just offering perspective. She had a unique relationship with Mom, that's for sure. She just inserted herself when things were at their most fragile. One of the women, a silver-haired friend of Mom's who used to braid my hair when I was little, let out a slow sigh. "That's low," she said. "Not quiet enough to be missed." Aunt Irene stood without a word. She met my eyes just for a moment, then walked out through the French doors with her purse on her shoulder and her chin lifted. No scene, no parting remarks. I didn't follow. I sat for another minute, then placed my cup gently on its saucer and stood. My steps weren't rushed. I walked toward the center of the room, the air changing around me as I moved. Conversations paused. Heads turned slightly. "Kaylee," I said, steady and clear. She turned all smiles, but it cracked around the edges when she saw my face. "I never needed to manipulate anyone," I said, "and I have every document to prove it." The room stilled. She blinked. "Excuse me." I folded my arms gently. I kept everything. The emails, signed forms, voicemails, even the one Mom left me after you filed the power of attorney without telling her. There was a quiet cough somewhere near the buffet. Chairs shifted again, this time facing me. "You want to accuse me publicly?" I asked. "Then I'll go public with the truth." Kaylee's face paled. Her voice climbed higher. "You wouldn't." I didn't look away. "You've mistaken quiet for weak. You always have." She opened her mouth to speak, then closed it. Her hands dropped to her sides. I didn't yell. I didn't gloat. I just walked back to my seat and picked up my coffee again. But when I glanced up just once, I saw it something in her face I hadn't seen before. Not guilt, not regret. Panic, like she'd realized I wasn't going to disappear this time. A few days passed without a word. Then late one morning, I found a manila envelope stuffed into my mailbox, wedged in so deep I had to bend the flap just to pull it loose. My name was typed across the front. No return address. Inside was a court summons. Kaylee had filed a formal motion to contest the will. She claimed our mother had been under emotional duress, that I'd coerced a dying woman into rewriting her estate. The phrase in bold, undue influence. I stood in the hallway holding the packet, the words circling in my head like a storm that hadn't broken yet. I didn't call anyone. I just walked into my office, shut the door behind me, and knelt beside the old oak file cabinet Mom helped me refinish the year I finished grad school. The bottom drawer stuck. Probably humidity. But I pulled until it gave. Inside was the red folder. I hadn't touched it since Mom gave it to me back when she'd asked if I could keep something just in case. The label on the tab read, Supplement Addendum 3 in her handwriting. Inside were signed and notarized documents dated during her final month in hospice. They detailed everything. Kaylee's attempt to sell the house, bank statements showing withdrawals, luxury spa charges, jewelry, even a down payment on a car that was never logged as a gift. There was a letter to the estate attorney and a small note to me. "Don't delete these," she'd written, just in case I forget later. I opened another folder and found the printed emails. Mom had forwarded copies to me when she started to worry Kaylee had changed her login credentials. "You'll know what to do," she'd written. That afternoon, I called the legal clinic I'd visited once years ago when helping a friend through a guardianship hearing. A woman answered, professional and warm. "Do you have supporting documentation?" she asked. "I have more than that," I said. "I have her voice." 3 days after the summons arrived, I walked into the county courthouse with the red folder tucked inside my tote bag. I wore a navy blouse and beige slacks. Nothing flashy, just neat, just steady. The kind of outfit you wear when you want to be noticed for your presence, not your appearance. I passed Kaylee on the courthouse steps. She was talking to her attorney, whispering behind her hand like I was just some inconvenience to be handled. Inside, the marble floor gleamed under the overhead lights. I made my way to the front desk, handed the clerk the folder, and watched her flip through the contents. Her fingers paused halfway down the stack. Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Is this the decedent's handwriting?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "It's notarized, witnessed, and dated." She kept flipping. Then her voice dropped just a bit. "You may want to sit down for this one," she muttered, not to me but to the woman at the next station who leaned over for a better look. I stayed where I was, steady on my feet. I signed the counter-motion papers, thanked her, and stepped aside. That evening, I sat at my desk in the back room of the house. Light spilled across the surface, soft and warm, catching the worn edges of old folders and the curve of a chipped picture frame that held a photo of Mom and me from years ago. I stared at the signed documents, the emails, the bank records. But more than anything, I thought about the way Kaylee had rewritten the story, erased the nights I sat by Mom's bedside, pretended those long hours didn't happen, glossed over the soup I made when Mom couldn't hold down solid food, the sound of the oxygen machine humming beside her pillow, the way she gripped my hand when she was too tired to speak. I said it aloud, even though no one else was in the room. She's not just trying to fight me for the estate. She's trying to erase me. The next morning I left before the sun fully cleared the horizon. I parked a block away from the courthouse, choosing the walkover, pulling up directly to the entrance. The plaza out front was already busy. I saw tripods set up, camera crews leaning into boom mics, and small badges clipped to suit jackets and blouses press credentials. And in the middle of it all stood Kaylee. She wore a pale lavender coat and held herself like a woman on the brink of tears. Her makeup was soft, tasteful, and her voice hit all the right notes as she spoke to a reporter. "I only ever tried to protect our mother," she said, her lower lip trembling just slightly. "But money changes people." The journalist nodded sympathetically. "We understand your sister is due to arrive shortly." Kaylee's smile tightened. "Yes, I'm sure she has her version." I stood just out of frame, close enough to hear every word, far enough not to be noticed. That was her plan: frame the story before I could respond. Cast herself as the responsible daughter, paint me as the opportunist, let the cameras carry her version out into the world. But I'd come prepared. When the journalist spotted me, she turned. "Miss Foster, would you like to respond to your sister's statement?" I didn't answer right away. I reached into my bag and pulled out a sealed envelope, handed it to her without a word. She opened it slowly. Inside were email threads with timestamps, copies of wire transfers from Mom's joint account, and a notarized letter written by Mom's hospice nurse dated just weeks before she passed. The nurse had written patient-voiced concern over unauthorized access to her accounts by daughter Kaylee, recommended third-party review, logged-in care file. The journalist's lips moved as she scanned the contents. She looked up. "Where did you get this?" "My mother gave it to me," I said. "She knew this day might come." Before she could respond, a voice rose from the crowd. "I can confirm that." We turned. A woman stood near the back wearing a lanyard with a faded badge. "I was her night nurse," she said. "I filed that report. I was there the night." Kaylee raised her voice and waved a checkbook over her mother's bed. She was recovering from pneumonia. She cried herself to sleep afterward. The murmurs started then. A man stepped slightly away from Kaylee. Another woman shook her head. The mood shifted just a little. Kaylee's composure slipped. "This is a smear campaign," she said sharply. "None of that proves anything." She was dying. She didn't know what she was saying. I faced her, voice steady. She knew exactly what she was saying. She changed her will after you tried to move her out of her own home. You brought a realtor into the house while she was asleep and talked about gutting the kitchen for resale value. Kaylee's mouth opened, then closed again. I didn't raise my voice. I'm not here to ruin you. I'm just done pretending. I'm done being quiet while you rewrite the truth. The cameras turned toward me. I didn't flinch. I didn't pose. I just stood still, the truth in hand, the nurse standing behind me and the storm Kaylee thought she'd control already turning on her. We entered the courthouse minutes later. The courtroom was nearly full. People I hadn't seen in years, neighbors, extended relatives, women from Mom's old Sunday school class. Some looked from Kaylee's bright blazer to my plain gray dress. This wasn't a hearing anymore. It was theater. Kaylee stood by the table, a folder in her hands. Probably the old version of the will, the one signed when Mom was sick and barely out of the hospital. The judge entered. Everyone rose. The session began. We are here to finalize the probate of the estate of May Foster, the judge said. We will hear evidence from both parties. Kaylee stepped forward. Your Honor, this is my mother's original, legally recognized will. It names me as sole executor and heir. My sister wasn't involved in her care. She only came around once the documents were complete. I believe my mother was pressured. The courtroom stirred. Reporters scribbled in notebooks. The judge turned to me. Miss Caroline Foster, do you wish to respond? I stood slowly. Yes, Your Honor. I have a later will, signed, dated, and notarized, 1 month after the document presented by my sister. I walked forward and handed it over in a sealed envelope. My mother's handwriting stretched softly across the flap. The judge slit the seal and read silently. He nodded. This document appears legally valid, dated July 9th, witnessed by Irene Foster and Jeanette Holloway, notarized by Erica Platt. Kaylee stepped forward quickly. That's a forgery. She faked it. I didn't flinch. I turned toward the AV technician. Would you play the file, please? The screen came to life. My mother appeared thinner, tired, but clear-eyed and calm. If this is being played, she said, it means Kaylee has tried again to twist my words. I made another will because she tried to put me in assisted living against my wishes. She contacted a realtor. She took money without permission. Caroline protected me. That's why everything is hers, and it was my choice. Kaylee didn't move. Her jaw stayed tight, her hands rigid at her sides. The judge looked up. This confirms testamentary intent. I accept the July 9th will as the valid document unless irrefutable evidence of fraud is presented. At this time, I see none. He looked at me. Do you have anything further to add? I shook my head. Only that I loved my mother, and I respected her wishes. Aunt Irene gave a small nod from the front row. The gavel fell. We stepped out into the afternoon light. Kaylee didn't follow. She stayed behind, seated in the corner, hunched slightly like the weight of it all had finally landed. I didn't turn around. We didn't speak as we left the courthouse. The press moved in with their usual rhythm camera shutters, clicking a few questions tossed in my direction, but I kept walking. Down the stone steps past the low murmur of voices, until the sound of it all began to fade behind me. Kaylee stayed inside. I didn't see her again that day. She hadn't followed me out, and I didn't look back. Rami pulled up in her old Toyota. She didn't ask anything, just leaned over, popped the passenger door open, and waited until I got in. I sat down slowly, hands still resting on the red folder. We didn't turn on the radio. There wasn't much to say. By the time we pulled into my driveway, the sky had shifted to that soft gray blue that settles in right before dusk. I got out, walked to the porch, and turned the key with a quiet click. Inside, everything was still. I set the folder down on the kitchen table and poured myself a glass of water I didn't finish. The next morning, Kaylee filed another motion. This one aimed to freeze all assets tied to the estate bank accounts, home repairs, insurance payouts. I found out from the lawyer's office just before noon. He sounded calm, but the words hit in a way that pulled me straight out of whatever peace I thought I'd earned. "She's trying to drag it out," he said. "This is a stall, a pressure tactic." I thanked him, then ended the call and walked down the hall to the office. The morning light was pouring in through the window, landing on the surface of the desk where the red folder still sat. I opened it again slowly, careful not to crease the edges of the pages. The original documents were still in order. Mom's revised will the hospice nurse's letter, notarized statements, but now I began pulling from deeper in the drawer. Bank records, dated transfers, signed emails, one from Kaylee to the estate lawyer sent just weeks before Mom was moved into hospice, another from Kaylee's real estate contact, casually referencing the backyard space and how the new kitchen could face the garden. I found the email Mom forwarded to me, the one she sent late at night, with a simple subject line, "For your records." And the voicemail. I hadn't listened to it since the day she left it. Her voice came through the speaker softer than I remembered, a little raspy, but clear. "If I forget this later," she said, "just remember what I told you. Don't let anyone move me. And keep the folder somewhere dry." The red one. That was all. No goodbye. No instructions beyond that. Just a small reminder tucked in the middle of a life she had tried to keep in order, even when others didn't. I clicked the phone screen off, then opened a clean envelope and started stacking documents. The originals first, then copies, then a printed transcript of the voicemail. That afternoon I called the legal clinic again. This time I was transferred directly to the same attorney who had helped prepare my initial response. She listened as I spoke, pausing only to ask a question about document dates or witness signatures. I gave her everything: names, locations, original filing numbers. She asked, "Do you have clear supporting evidence for everything in the response?" I told her yes. And more than that, I said, "I have every step she tried to erase. I have every step Mom took to protect it." We scheduled a follow-up for the end of the week. I ended the call, then sat in the kitchen with a fresh cup of tea, the red folder resting against my forearm like it had never left my side. That night, I couldn't sleep. I walked through the house, slowly passing by rooms that still held traces of my mother: her reading chair in the den, the old apron hanging behind the pantry door, a glass bowl filled with buttons on the hallway shelf. I turned on the porch light and sat out front for a while. The wind stirred the chimes, but the air stayed warm. By morning, I knew what I had to do next. The courthouse was quieter than it had been before. I arrived just after opening, walked through security, and headed straight for the probate clerk's office. I waited in line folder pressed tight against my side. When it was my turn, I stepped up, placed the sealed envelope on the counter, and spoke with a steady voice. "This is a supplemental response," I said, "including additional evidence requested in the case file." The clerk took it, peeled back the seal, and began flipping through the pages. She paused again, just like the other had done. She looked up. "You're submitting this as part of the counter to the motion to freeze the estate?" "Yes." She nodded, then handed me a pen. "Sign here and we'll mark it received." I did, with clear, full strokes. That evening, Romy came by with a casserole and a small stack of mail she'd picked up from my P.O. box. One of the envelopes was postmarked from Charleston, no return name, listed just the address Kaylee had been using. I set it aside. Later, after the dishes were done and Romy had gone home, I opened it. Inside were copies of deposit slips, 3 amounts circled in ink. I recognized the handwriting. Kaylee's, no note, no explanation. I placed the papers next to the rest of the documentation, then closed the drawer. There was no more hiding. She'd pushed every boundary she could through gossip, through the court, through subtle threats written on bank forms and soft-spoken interviews. But the folder held. The next motion would be filed by the end of the week, and I'd be ready, The hearing for the emergency freeze order was scheduled for the following Tuesday. I arrived early, parking in the same lot as before this time, with the red folder zipped inside a weathered leather briefcase. A light mist hung in the air, softening the courthouse's sharp lines. I walked through the double doors past the tiled floor and into a waiting room already half full with people murmuring over coffee and paper cups. Kaylee stood near the back, talking to a man in a gray suit. Her coat was newer than last time, deeper lavender tailored just right. She turned as I entered, and for a moment our eyes met. No nod, no expression, just a pause. Then she looked away. Inside the courtroom, the seats filled up faster than I expected. A few of Mom's old neighbors, 2 cousins I hadn't seen since high school. Even the pastor from her retirement chapel took a spot near the aisle. I sat in the front row behind the petitioner's table, folding my hands neatly in my lap as my attorney spread out our files in front of us. Kaylee's lawyer spoke first. Your Honor, we are here to petition for a temporary freeze on the execution of the estate of May Foster based on concerns of undue influence, emotional manipulation, and compromised testamentary capacity. The judge, a man in his 60s with a lined brow and clear voice, nodded once. I've read the documents submitted by both parties. Proceed. Kaylee stood, her voice polished and steady. My sister arrived late in our mother's care. I handled the day-to-day decisions, the bills, the prescriptions. When our mother grew confused, Caroline stepped in and used her vulnerability to shift control. The will you see now was signed while my mother was bedridden under the influence of medication. I don't believe she fully understood what she was doing. The room didn't react. No murmurs, just stillness. The judge turned to my side of the room. Miss Foster, do you have a response? I stood briefcase in hand and walked to the table. Yes, Your Honor, I have documents, emails, and audio recordings that show my mother was clear in her decisions. But more importantly, I have a statement, one she recorded herself. I'd like to submit it into evidence and play it for the court. The judge gestured to the AV clerk in the corner. I handed over the small flash drive. The screen behind the bench lit up. There she was, Mom wearing her soft blue sweater, seated in the hospice room, with sunlight pooling beside her. Her voice was calm. If this is being watched, she said, then it means Kaylee has tried to take control again. I want to be clear. I changed my will because Kaylee tried to sell my home without my permission. She moved money, signed documents behind my back. Caroline didn't coerce me. She respected my wishes when no one else would. The room stayed silent, even after the screen went dark. The judge looked over his glasses. Do you have any reason to doubt the authenticity of this recording? Kaylee's lawyer cleared his throat. We would need time to review the metadata, but... The judge held up a hand. The voice is clear, the intent is direct, and the notarized documents support the timeline. Kaylee stood up quickly. She didn't understand what she was signing. You're making a decision based on one video. No, the judge replied. I'm making it based on a legally valid will supported by consistent documentation, witness testimony, and the decedent's own words. Kaylee opened her mouth again, then sat down, her jaw tight. The judge turned back to me. Miss Foster, I see no reason to delay the administration of your mother's estate. The petition for a freeze is denied. He tapped his gavel once. As people began to shift in their seats and the clerk gathered paperwork, I remained still. I hadn't realized I'd been holding my breath. Outside, the wind had picked up. Reporters lingered near the entrance, but I kept moving. The sidewalk felt longer than I remembered. I reached the end of the block before I looked back. Kaylee hadn't exited yet. The press didn't follow me. Rami was waiting in the car just like before. How'd it go? She asked, not turning around as I closed the door. It's done, I said. For now. We didn't stop for lunch. Didn't talk much on the drive back, just the hum of tires on pavement and the sound of passing traffic. When we reached my house, the porch lights had already come on, even though it wasn't quite dark. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, the smell of lavender detergent still faint from the last load of sheets I'd washed. Rami paused at the doorway, then reached into her coat pocket. I almost forgot she said, pulling out something small. "This was tucked inside your mom's wallet. Found it when I was helping sort through the boxes last week. It was an envelope, a little worn. My name written across the front in familiar cursive. I didn't open it right away. Just sat on the porch swing and held it between my hands. The cicadas buzzed in the trees and the air hung still. When I did finally peel it open, the letter inside was short. To my quiet one it read, "I know you'll never ask for credit, but I want you to know what you did mattered. You were there, you were steady, and you saw me when it counted. Love always, Mom." I folded it once carefully and placed it back in the envelope. The porch light flickered, then steadied again. The house was quiet, and for the first time in a long while, it felt like home. By the time the ruling became official, word had already made its way through the family. I didn't announce it. I didn't need to. The courthouse transcript was public, and the probate office had mailed certified copies of the judge's final order. Still, the calls didn't come. No apologies. No soft landings. What came instead were small signs. A thank you card from my mother's former Sunday school partner, tucked with a pressed rose inside. A voicemail from Cousin Mark, who said he'd always known something felt off at the will reading, but didn't have the words back then. And from Aunt Irene, a warm yellow envelope, hand-addressed, no return message inside except a single line. "She would have been proud of you for standing your ground." I placed it in the kitchen drawer beside the measuring spoons where Mom used to keep letters she couldn't throw away. Kaylee didn't reach out, but I heard her name through others third hand mostly. She'd gone quiet on social media, skipped a charity event she usually co-chaired. Her husband Michael filed for a separation less than a month later. I only knew because someone forwarded the local paper's announcement, the kind printed in small columns with no photographs. At the estate, the garden had started to bloom again. Late summer had settled over everything, softening the air. I walked the back path one afternoon, the one that curved behind the hedges where Kaylee once brought the architect to sketch a redesign. The bench was still there, rusted a little at the edges but steady. I sat for a while listening to the birds, letting the breeze move past without trying to catch it. Inside the house, the rooms had changed, but gently. I hadn't touched the layout. Mom's quilt still hung across the foot of the guest bed. The ceramic rooster she'd always kept above the fridge was back in place. I opened the windows on warm days, let the smell of rosemary and old pine drift through the hallways. One evening I hosted a small brunch. Nothing formal, just coffee, fruit, and a plate of buttermilk biscuits I made from Mom's old recipe. A few of her friends came, some neighbors. Even the hospice nurse Jeanette stopped by on her way home from her shift. She brought a card and a tiny potted orchid with a note that read, "Thank you for letting the truth have a place." No one brought up Kaylee, and I didn't offer her name. The talk stayed light music books, the kind of weather we hadn't seen since spring. But now and then, someone would pause, look around the room, and rest their gaze just a little longer than usual. They noticed. They remembered. As people began to say their goodbyes, I gathered plates and poured the last of the coffee into a travel mug for Jeanette. She paused at the doorway, turning back once. "She trusted you," she said quietly. "I hope you don't forget that." I nodded. Later that night, I sat out on the porch swing, a glass of water in one hand and the folded letter from Mom in the other. I hadn't reread it since that first night, but the weight of it hadn't changed. I could still hear her voice in the curves of each sentence, still feel the steadiness she left behind in the spaces between her words. Across the street porch, lights flickered on one by one. A child's bike leaned against a mailbox. Somewhere down the block, wind chimes moved just enough to catch the edge of a song. I looked out past the railing, past the rows of hedges, and let the silence stretch without rushing to fill it. It wasn't cold. It wasn't hollow. It just was. There was no announcement, no banner hung across the yard that read, "Justice served." But it had been. Not with a speech, not even with a verdict. It had been served in the quiet that followed, in the way Kaylee's voice no longer echoed in every room, in the way no one laughed when she tried to spin the truth, in the way her story no longer stood without question, and in the way mine finally did. The seasons turned quietly that year. Summer drifted into fall, and the old foster house settled into itself again. Most days I found a kind of peace moving from room to room, wiping down counters, folding laundry, watching the light change through the windows the way Mom always did. The sharp edges of the past months dulled, smoothed out by ordinary routines. Even the garden seemed to breathe easier, the rosemary growing wild around the front steps, the porch swing creaking just enough to let me know the world hadn't stopped. Kaylee's absence didn't echo like I expected. The phone stayed silent, and for once I didn't wait for her name to show up on the caller ID. Sometimes on Sunday afternoons, I'd sit out with a glass of sweet tea and reread Mom's last letter. The words weren't fancy, but they stayed with me. She'd written, "Some truths aren't spoken, they're lived, and you lived it right." It wasn't forgiveness, not exactly, and it wasn't regret. It was a kind of quiet blessing. The people who mattered kept showing up. Rami would stop by after work sometimes just to sit on the steps and watch the sky change colors. Aunt Irene came with a fresh pie on holidays, her smile gentle, her words few. Even Jeanette, the hospice nurse, would wave from her car now and then. I noticed that the house didn't feel so big anymore, not when laughter found its way back into the kitchen or when a friend's voice carried through the hallway. I never set out to win anything. I only wanted to honor what was left my mother's wishes, my own sense of what was right, and the years I spent quietly standing in the background. When it was all finished, I realized something I hadn't understood before. Sometimes the hardest justice is the kind that happens without applause. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is simply refuse to disappear. As autumn faded and the days grew shorter, I found myself planting bulbs along the garden path, planning for spring. Life wasn't perfect, and I didn't expect it to be. But I knew deep down that I wasn't living for anyone else's approval anymore. I'd built my own space and filled it with small moments that mattered. If you've listened this far, I hope you'll take a moment for yourself today. Maybe remember someone who saw you even when others didn't. And if you're willing, I'd love to hear your story in the comments below or have you join this community by subscribing. Sometimes sharing our quiet victories is how we help each other find home again.